Another interesting thing is that you have to, that, if we're talking hypothetical here, let's say Rice Eccles is sold out. You've got a full on sea of red in those stands. BYU has not beaten Utah at Utah since 2006, the famous Beck to Harleen. That's back when I was wearing blue. That's a game that my dad and I, were watching, and I was cheering against Utah. Now I've since come to my senses, but Caleb, what do you think it would take for BYU to come into Rice Eccles and 14 years later to get a W, realistically?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's tough, obviously. I mean, there's a reason it's been 10 years, right? Well, and it's been even longer, you mentioned, at Rice Eccles. And I think it really, really has to do with that that capacity and just like mental ability to control the emotions. Honestly, that seems like what's been the biggest factor for me. I think it was the game a couple of years ago. BYU went up by a couple touchdowns, second half, early in the third quarter, leading by a couple touchdowns at halftime, right? And it seemed like they were using those emotions to come out and be aggressive, like you mentioned. And I don't know what the answer is to maintain that aggressive nature, but also at the same time avoid those mistakes, right? Because it seems like for BYU, it kind of goes hand in hand. When we're aggressive, we have turnovers, right? And so I think that's where, that ability to just control those emotions. And I think being consistent. We couldn't even be consistent for a whole game 2 years ago, right? We were one team in the first half, a different team in the second half. So consistency from quarter to quarter and from year to year is really what it's going to take. The past couple of years for BYU have been maddening for fans because we look amazing against teams like USC, like Tennessee, like Wisconsin, right? And then we turn around and we lose to Utah, right? Like, who loses to Utah? I don't know.
Most of the Pac-12 South, but I'm just.
Yes, the lauded Pac-12 South. I like it. So yeah, I mean, consistency, and then I'm not going to use it as an excuse necessarily, but injuries have played a large factor in BYU's seasons recently, and unfortunately this season as well with Matt Bushman. Our offensive coordinator, Jeff Grimes, he said that in all of his years of coaching, I think he's been a coach for 20 plus years. He said he's never seen a year of injuries as bad as BYU had last year. So I think it's going to take consistency and being healthy. And like I said from the start, being able to grow from year to year with a veteran team in order for us to beat Utah.
Yeah, I agree. I think injuries has been one of the biggest things that has consistently plagued BYU, especially last year. Last year was hard because at one point, weren't you guys down to like your fourth string quarterback at some point during the season? Yeah. See, that's insane that the injury bug bit BYU so bad that they were playing their fourth string quarterback. I think if they have a healthy BYU team, I don't ever want to see BYU beat Utah in my lifetime, but if I had to see it, I think BYU needs to be a healthy team. They need to be focused, like you already mentioned, is like that game is probably, depending on the schedule for BYU, that could be their biggest game of the season. Like they always talk about the rivalry games, which for BYU is like Utah State, Boise State. Those are their games. And I think they let their emotions get the better of them in most of those games. The Boise State BYU game is always a low scoring and messy game. Like you never know what's going to happen. Usually like one year, I think the final score was like 7-6. If that's not like a game, like, is it a defensive game? Was it just a messy game? What was it? They need to stay focused, but I don't see BYU beating Utah for the next couple of years. Until BYU also can get into a P5 conference and be able to get to the level of recruiting that Utah's at, I don't see it happening. Utah and BYU go after a lot of the same kids locally here in state, but at the same time, Utah is able to take these 3-star prospects and turn them into NFL stars. BYU seems to do it occasionally, but not all the time. And I think if they can get to the same level on the recruiting scale that Utah's on, or even just a little bit better, they have a better chance of beating Utah.
Yeah, I've got my take on this subject, but I want to ask Caleb a question. Caleb, what impact do you think being an independent team has had, not only on the rivalry itself, but the quality of your recruits and being able to put together really good teams? Because I mean, this rivalry has gone back and forth. I mean, during the 80s and 90s, it was swapped. I mean, BYU just owned Utah, and now it's switched again. Do you think being independent has had much of an impact on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to say it hasn't. Just to give a little bit of context from my point of view, though. So, my parents both went to Utah State, so I did not grow up a BYU fan or a Utah fan, or honestly, they weren't even really big Aggie fans either. Um, I came to BYU for the first time in 2013, and that is when I actually started following the team. So we were already independent at that point. We had already started losing to you guys at that point. So I've only ever known
What it's like
BYU
to lose.
losses. Unfortunately, it's been a tough lifetime of a fan for me. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think if nothing else, recruiting is one thing, I think, but just from like a mentality standpoint, I feel like when you're part of a conference, you have this idea that you're part of something bigger, right? You're part of something with a reputation, with a certain level of competition. Whereas being an independent, it's like you're the underdog all the time. And so, to play year after year as an underdog, to play year after year like you're just fighting for that next win, and you don't really have a lot of that maybe like support around you, or like a conference, frankly. I'm sure it can be tough mentally, for BYU to always be scrapping like that, right? And trying to find, I mean, this year, as good as any other year, is an example of what it's like to be an independent, because we lost all of our games because they were canceled due to COVID, and we were not affiliated with anything else, so we had to literally scrap a schedule together from other teams that were willing to play us. And for once, we're not so much an underdog because we're playing a lot of the underdog teams. But I think it definitely, especially from like a mental standpoint, I feel like it can definitely have an effect.
Yeah, no, I like what you said there. And being independent for BYU, I think it has its benefits. I mean, you guys are able to play on ESPN a lot, which is great exposure. And another thing too is you guys are able to play a lot of pretty high level teams. I mean, you played USC last year and you beat them. You played Tennessee. You went into Tennessee and you beat those guys. And that is one thing that's very respectable about BYU being independent is and I think very similarly to Utah, is a lot of times they do play to they rise to the occasion. They play to the level of their opponent. There's very rarely is BYU being just absolutely blown out in a game. Even the games that they lose are usually relatively close. But what I think the issue is with the Holy War is they like what's going to make the difference, what's going to break the streak is BYU has got to remove the psychological restraints that the Holy War, I think, has placed on them. Utah sees BYU as this insignificant little brother to the south that they beat up. They don't have to worry about it. They don't have to look over their shoulder and see what's going on. BYU comes around, they smack them around a little bit and throw them back down south. And there is a different feel to these games, but clearly Utah has been able to execute, kind of what you've talked about earlier. Utah has been able to execute. Now, something interesting to me is while Utah fans at times can be cocky about the rivalry, I mean, we have won 9 straight. BYU has lost to Utah BYU has lost to Utah, like I said, 9 straight times. Of those 9 losses, 8 have been decided by a single possession. Mm-hmm. So it's not like BYU is just trying to slay this giant dragon. It's right there. I mean, like you're mentioning, 2 years ago, Utah is down 20-0 at half and then down 27-7, and they rally in the fourth quarter and they win 35-27. And I think it was either a year or two before that, Taysom Hill goes for the 2-point conversion to win the game, doesn't get it. And then in, I believe, 2013, BYU had 2 attempts to kick a field goal for the win, and it doesn't happen. And so it's right there, but they've got, to me, it's just psychological and a little bit of talent. But I think mostly psychological.
I also think with them joining a conference would solve a lot of these issues. Like Caleb mentioned, being a part of a conference is being a part of something that's bigger. The reason why Utah sees BYU as a little brother is because we're more focused on going for a Pac-12 championship. We're focused on the bigger fish to fry. Until BYU can get in a conference, they're not going to be in that mentality. They're in that mentality still of, oh, we've got to beat Utah because beating Utah makes a season for us. Because they don't have those hopes of postseason. They do. They can go bowling, but their chances of making the college football playoff are slim to none unless they have a freaking loaded schedule, which probably won't happen. If they can just get into a conference, that will help break down some of these psychological barriers that they've built up for themselves. Because at the end of the day, Utah is playing for something bigger. And if BYU could be able to be like, oh, we're playing for something bigger too, this is just another game, I think that they would have a better shot at winning.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big factor here as far as the importance that BYU fans place on this game is just like the nostalgia factor. I think Cole mentioned it. You know, a lot of our fans are like middle-aged, right? They were young back in the 80s and 90s with those really, really good BYU teams, and they're so used to BYU being so good, and they have that idea, a lot of times an unrealistic idea, right, of this BYU team. And so I think that's why it's just such a big deal for so many people. Every single year, you know, there's like these polls that go out from BYU fans and stuff, and it's like, would you rather like go undefeated or would you rather beat Utah? And like a lot of times they would rather beat Utah than go undefeated. It's just like, it's such a big thing, like Cole mentioned, psychologically. And I think that gets to the players as well. And I would agree, you know, because they have been such close games, I think you can really point to the mental aspect rather than the talent gap and say, okay, if they had just made that field goal, okay, if they had just not thrown that interception, you know, the games could be a lot different. So I think that's really where the key lies, is in avoiding those errors and just making sure you're taking care of business. Just a business trip, right?